Ever get to the end of something you've read, like a really detailed article, or maybe even just a long email, and you think, wait, what did I actually take away from that?
Hmm. It's a feeling I know, well, you, as someone who's always trying to understand things more deeply, are probably familiar with.
Oh, absolutely. We've all been there.
Right.
You know, the act of reading the words happens, but the real understanding,
Hmm.
sometimes it feels a bit elusive, doesn't it?
Right. And that brings us to a concept that's pretty key to really grasping what we read. It's called metacognition in reading. Now, that might sound a bit academic, but okay, let's unpack this. It's essentially thinking about your own thinking while you're reading, like having a little internal detective asking, am I actually following this? Does this make sense to me?
Exactly. And this ability to sort of step back and monitor our own comprehension is incredibly powerful. It's not just about understanding the current sentence. It's about building a solid foundation of knowledge and, crucially, avoiding that overwhelmed feeling when you're faced with a lot of information. So for this deep dive, we're looking at a really influential piece of research, a 1989 article by Linda Baker. It dives deep into how adult readers monitor their comprehension. You'd think of it as a foundational look at how we make sense of what we read.
It is indeed. Baker's article synthesized a lot of what was known back then about how adults engage with reading comprehension, the kind of stumbling blocks they encounter, and the strategies that can help them become more effective readers. And even though it's from, a few decades ago, the core insights are still incredibly relevant to how we learn and process information today.
Our mission, then, is to extract the really valuable stuff from this research to help you understand how you, and adults in general, approach reading, where we often get tripped up, and what practical steps we can take to become more effective learners. This isn't just abstract theory. It's about giving you tools you can actually use to make your learning journey smoother and, well, less overwhelming. So when we talk about how adults think about their reading, where do we even start?
Well, one of the first things Baker's article highlights is that adults aren't all the same in how they approach reading. Like, we have different ideas about what it even means to understand something and how we keep track of our comprehension as we go. To understand these different perspectives, researchers have used a range of interesting methods.
Okay, what kind of methods are we talking about? I can't imagine it's just as simple as asking, hey, do you understand this?
Oh, not at all. One really insightful method is called think aloud protocols. This involves asking people to literally, verbalize their thoughts as they read. What are they focusing on? What questions pop up? Where do they feel confused? This gives researchers a direct window into the reading process, though, as we'll see later, even these direct reports aren't always perfect reflections of what's happening. Researchers also collect written comments from readers while they're reading, capturing immediate reactions. Checklists are another tool asking how often they use specific techniques. And then there are retrospective reports, reflecting after reading, and introspective reports, trying to describe thinking during the process.
So it's about gathering data from multiple angles to get a more complete picture. Now, you mentioned we need to be a bit careful when we rely on these self-report methods. Why is that?
Yeah, that's a really important point to keep in mind when we look at this kind of research. What people say they do doesn't always perfectly match up with what they actually do. Baker points to a couple of studies as examples. In one, students claimed they used loads of study techniques, but when observers watched them, well, they barely saw them used. In another, students who underlined text often didn't even report doing it. So there can be both over-reporting, where we think we're doing something more than we are, and under-reporting, where we're maybe not even consciously aware of some of our actions.
It's human nature, isn't it? We might have an idealized view of our study habits, or we might just be on autopilot sometimes.
Exactly. However, Baker also notes that there's often a pretty good level of agreement between what people report and what they do, especially when you combine these verbal reports with other ways of observing reading behavior. So, while we need to be mindful of these potential discrepancies, self-report remains, a valuable tool. Now, when we look at what proficient or expert readers tell us they do, what kind of patterns start to emerge? What sets them apart?
Ah, the experts.
Right.
What are they doing differently in their heads? Well, according to the article, these expert readers, often people like graduate students or professionals, report using a whole range of really effective strategies. Things like setting clear goals before they even start reading, actively trying to connect what they're reading to what they already know, and constantly trying to fit any new information into their existing understanding. The key takeaway seems to be that expert readers are active engagers with the text, not just passive recipients.
That's a perfect way to put it. They're not just letting the words wash over them, they're actively making connections, trying to build a coherent understanding. And a lot of these strategies do double duty. They help with understanding and act as a way to monitor that understanding, like distinguishing important info from details. That shows good grasp. And formulating questions as they read, another key strategy. Keeps them engaged, checks comprehension. It's like they're having an internal dialogue with the text, constantly asking why and how does this fit?
Exactly. It's like they're having a conversation with the author in their own minds. Now, the article also touches on how expert readers deal with those moments when they don't understand something. That research by Brighter and Bird, mentioned in the article, looked specifically at this.
Yes, Brighter and Bird found that expert readers have this kind of toolkit for when they hit a snag. These include restatement, putting complex ideas into their own simpler words just to check if they truly grasp them, backtracking to reread earlier sections for missing context, identifying unclear bits and anticipating they might be explained later, and even framing the difficulty as a specific problem to solve. So it's not just recognizing when things are going well, but also having a proactive approach for when things get challenging.
So it's not just about understanding when things are smooth sailing, but also having a set of tools for when you hit rough waters. Makes sense. Now, the article also talks about how our existing knowledge in a particular area, what's called domain expertise, influences how we read. That study comparing law professors and novices sounds really insightful.
Oh, it is fascinating. Linda Berg discovered that the legal experts use a very different set of strategies, and way more frequently than the novices. Things like really using the specific context of the legal case, getting a broad overview before diving into specifics, rereading analytically to pick out crucial legal arguments, underlining key points strategically, synthesizing info from different parts, and constantly evaluating the arguments. It really shows how knowing the field helps you navigate the reading process itself.
And what were the novices doing differently? What were their main struggles like?
Interestingly, the novices often got really bogged down in the legal terminology, expressing confusion about specific legal terms, even familiar words used in a specialized way. This focus on individual word meaning, as Baker points out, is something we also see in younger, less experienced readers. Also, the novices tended to blame themselves, thinking, oh, I'm not smart enough, rather than considering the text itself might be complex or assume background knowledge, and the experts. Much better at using their understanding of the text type, a legal case, to focus on important parts and adjust their reading speed.
It really shows how knowing the landscape of a subject helps you navigate the map of the text. And Afflerbach's work on how familiarity affects what clues we use to decide what's important. That adds another layer, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Afflerbach's research with experts and novices in fields like, say, chemistry and anthropology showed they relied on different kinds of cues to judge importance. These cues could come from their own existing knowledge, the text structure itself, like headings or bold text, or even author signals. What's really interesting is that the specific cues they paid attention to depended on both how familiar they were with the topic and their specific reading goals. If you're an expert, you just have a much better sense of what's likely to be central.
Okay, so the experts have these really sophisticated active strategies. But what about the differences between people who are generally considered better readers and those who struggle more? Does this ability to think about our own reading, does metacognitive awareness play a role there?
The research, as Baker summarizes it, points to a pretty clear yes on that. We see differences not just between very strong and struggling adult readers, but also between those who score higher and lower on standard reading comprehension tests, even when their overall intelligence seems similar. Now, it's worth noting there have been a few studies that haven't found a strong link between what people say they do and their performance, but the overall trend definitely suggests a connection.
And the article highlights a really fascinating point. These differences often show up in the strategies we use for actually understanding the text, not just trying to remember it later. That study by Kaufman comparing high and low comprehenders is a great example, right?
It is. Kaufman found that while both groups might use similar observable strategies, like underlining, the high comprehenders reported using significantly more inside-the-head strategies when they hit comprehension problems. They were actively trying to make sense of the difficult parts, rephrasing things internally, trying different mental approaches. It's like the better readers have a more active internal problem-solving process going on.
Exactly. It's not just about highlighting. It's about what's going on in your mind as you're doing it. And the research by Spring, comparing students in remedial programs with good readers, that also sheds a lot of light on these differences, doesn't it?
It does. Spring's work showed good readers more frequently used comprehension-focused strategies like actively relating info to existing knowledge, identifying logical connections, pinpointing important ideas. They also engaged in more critical reading, thinking about the author's perspective, evaluating the information. Interestingly, they didn't find much difference in how often the two groups used general study strategies, except that good readers actually tended to outline less frequently.
That's surprising. Why would good readers outline less? Seems like outlining would be helpful for everyone.
That's a common assumption, right? But Spring suggests that poor readers might over-rely on these more surface-level study techniques, like detailed outlining, maybe as a way to compensate for underlying difficulties with understanding the text itself. They might be trying to create an external structure because they're not fully grasping the internal logic. This has some really important implications for teaching reading, suggesting that just focusing on study skills for struggling readers might miss the core issue of comprehension. We might need to focus more on helping them develop those active understanding strategies.
That makes a lot of sense. If you truly understand the material, maybe the need for a super detailed external structure becomes less critical. Now, what about how better and poorer readers handle texts that are challenging? Kletzin's findings on persistence are quite telling, aren't they?
They really are. Kletzine found that when faced with difficult passages, better readers tended to stick with their strategies, trying different approaches. They might reread, slow down, try to rephrase. Poorer readers, on the other hand, were more likely to simply give up, stop actively engaging when it got tough. It speaks to a difference in their approach to learning, maybe their willingness to persevere.
That really highlights a difference in resilience.
Yeah.
And the research by Fisher and Mandel on how good and poor readers respond when they realize they're not understanding something, that adds another important dimension.
Exactly. Their work showed that while both groups do monitor their comprehension to some extent, the response to confusion is very different. Poor readers often experience negative feelings about themselves as learners and didn't really try to actively overcome the challenges. Good readers, however, use those moments of confusion as valuable feedback, a signal to adjust strategies, try something different. They saw it as a chance to learn about their own reading process.
So it's not just about noticing the problem. It's about having a constructive and proactive response. Okay, now we've talked about how these metacognitive strategies seem linked to being a better reader, but does that connection extend to actual performance, like getting better test scores or higher grades?
The evidence strongly suggests it does. Block's research, for instance, found students who reported actively monitoring their comprehension and taking steps to deal with difficulties tended to have better recall and achieved higher GPAs. And Fisher and Mandel's work hints that effectively regulating comprehension, knowing what to do when you don't understand, might be even more crucial for academic performance than just being aware. Awareness is step one, but taking action leads to better outcomes.
That makes perfect sense. Being aware you don't understand is only helpful if you then know what to do about it. And Garner and Alexander's finding that students who actively tried to predict test questions based on their reading actually performed better. That's a really specific example of how a targeted metacognitive approach can pay off.
It is. It shows how a focused metacognitive strategy, like thinking about assessment, can significantly impact learning. And the research also indicates that the more strategies a student has, and the more sophisticated their criteria for evaluating their own understanding, the better they tend to do academically. Ryan's work, for example, found students using a wider range of criteria, especially higher-level ones focusing on understanding and application, earn better grades.
This all seems incredibly relevant to success in school, but the article also points out these skills aren't just for academics. They play a role in the workplace, too. The research by Michaleki and colleagues with nurses and electronics technicians sounds particularly interesting here.
Absolutely. Their findings suggest that what they called metacognitive literacy skills, things like actively questioning the text, focusing on main ideas, having a clear reading purpose, were much more common in people rated as superior performers in their jobs compared to those considered just adequate. What's really striking is that the basic reading skills of these two groups weren't necessarily different. This implies it's the ability to actively engage with and monitor understanding of workplace texts that sets top performers apart, even beyond just basic literacy.
That's a really powerful insight. It suggests improving these metacognitive skills could have significant real-world benefits way beyond the classroom.
Yeah.
Now, the article moves on to discuss how individuals tend to have consistent patterns in how they use these strategies. It's not just a random mix, right?
Exactly. Chaffee's research identified that people tend to fall into certain clusters. Some are more text-driven, focusing heavily on the words and structure. Others are more reader-driven, bringing their own prior knowledge and experiences strongly into play. And then there are those using interactive strategies, actively engaging, constantly monitoring, understanding, adjusting their approach. Interestingly, these interactive clusters almost always included strong monitoring strategies. So the more actively engaged and reflective readers tend to naturally incorporate self-monitoring.
So the more engaged and reflective you are, the more likely you are to be thinking about your own understanding. And Block's work with remedial students, identifying integrators and non-integrators, illustrates these different patterns too, doesn't it?
It does. Block found integrators who actively tried to connect new info with old, thought about the overall structure, monitored comprehension, and dealt with difficulties, showed better recall, and made more academic progress compared to non-integrators. The non-integrators tended to focus more on isolated details, often had more emotional reactions rather than active problem solving. In many ways, these integrators really resembled the expert readers we talked about earlier.
It's really fascinating how these fundamentally different approaches can have such a significant impact on learning. And then there's Ryan's research connecting our underlying beliefs about knowledge itself to how we evaluate our comprehension. That whole idea of dualist versus relativist thinking is quite intriguing.
It is. Ryan built on Perry's theory about different beliefs on the nature of knowledge. Dualists tend to see knowledge as clear-cut facts, right or wrong. They often evaluate comprehension based on how many facts they can remember. Relativists, on the other hand, see knowledge as more complex, contextual, interconnected. They're more likely to assess understanding based on seeing relationships between ideas and how they can apply the information.
And Ryan's findings supported this, right? Students who were more dualistic tended to focus on just recalling info as their measure of understanding, while the more relativistic ones used more sophisticated, comprehension-oriented standards like explaining ideas in their own words, making connections. And crucially, students who used a wider range of criteria, including at least one of those higher-level comprehension application standards, ended up getting better grades. It really suggests our fundamental beliefs about what it means to know something can shape how we learn and judge our own success.
Precisely. It highlights the importance of not just acquiring information, but also thinking critically about it, understanding its broader implications. Now, shifting gears a bit, the article also delves into how well adults actually monitor their comprehension in real time as they're reading. The error detection paradigm has been a key research tool here.
Yes, those are the studies where researchers deliberately put problems or errors into texts and see how often readers notice them. But the article also cautions us not to take those detection rates at face value, pointing to Baker's 1979 study.
Exactly. Baker's study found students only detected about 38% of embedded problems. On the surface, that might seem like pretty poor monitoring. However, looking closer at what students were doing while reading and in their recall, they found many failures to report problems didn't mean they hadn't noticed something was off. Students often used fix-up strategies like going back, rereading, or trying to find clarification later without explicitly identifying the planted error.
So they were actively trying to make sense of things, even if they didn't consciously say, hey, mistake here. It really emphasizes that readers often try hard to build a coherent understanding, especially if they don't suspect the text is intentionally trying to trick them.
Absolutely. And this led researchers to be more thoughtful about instructing subjects in these studies. If you tell someone they might encounter errors, they'll likely be more vigilant. Now, Baker's later work in '85, where she identified 7 different standards adults use to evaluate comprehension, provides a really valuable framework for understanding why error detection rates might vary.
Yes, this idea of different internal benchmarks for deciding if we understand. Can you remind us of a few of those standards?
Sure. There's the most basic, the lexical standard, do we understand the individual words, like where a foreign language text or jargon trips you up. Then syntactic, does the grammar make sense? External consistency, does this align with what we know about the world? Propositional cohesiveness, do ideas within a short section connect logically? Internal consistency, are ideas throughout the entire text consistent? Structural cohesiveness, do different parts fit together thematically? And finally, informational completeness, does it provide all the info we need for our purpose?
That's a really comprehensive list, and it makes intuitive sense that some of these need much deeper analysis than others. Like, spotting a nonsense word, lexical standard, is probably easier than noticing a subtle contradiction between ideas far apart in an article, internal consistency. And Baker's research, where she manipulated problem types and looked at readers with different verbal abilities, really highlighted these differences, didn't it?
It did. Her '85 and '86 studies showed nonsense, Words were indeed easiest to spot, followed by statements contradicting prior knowledge, then contradictions within the text itself. This generally aligns with the increasing complexity of the standards being violated. Higher ability students and those given specific instructions about potential problems were much better at detection. Interestingly, she also found lower verbal ability students tended to rely more heavily on that basic lexical standard, focusing on whether words made sense perhaps because they were struggling with more complex analysis.
It's like they're focusing on the trees because they're having trouble seeing the forest. And even when adults can use multiple standards, Baker's research suggests they don't always apply them consistently or effectively. We might have the ability, but we don't always bring it to bear.
That's a really key takeaway. We have the potential, but we don't always use it fully. Now, to get a more direct look at this monitoring process as it's happening, researchers have also used process measures like tracking reading times and eye movements. This lets us see how readers interact with the text in real time, not just relying on reports afterwards.
Yes, moving beyond just asking people what they noticed to actually observing how their eyes move and how long they spend on different parts. The Baker and Anderson study with inconsistent sentences is a good example, right?
Exactly. They found even when students weren't told to look for inconsistencies, they spent more time reading sentences that contradicted earlier info, and they were more likely to look back and reread previous sentences. This suggests an almost automatic, maybe even subconscious level of monitoring going on. Our brains are picking up on inconsistencies even if we don't consciously register them immediately.
It's like our brains are saying, wait a minute, something doesn't quite add up here, even if our conscious awareness hasn't caught on yet. And the eye-tracking research by Grabe and his colleagues adds more detail, showing how our eye movements actually change when we hit these contradictions.
Right. Their work revealed that whether or not subjects were told to expect contradictions, their eye movements indicated different processing of contradictory sentences during the first reading. However, those specifically informed about contradictions did significantly more rereading on a second pass, suggesting a more deliberate, conscious effort to resolve them. It's like our eyes signal a potential problem, and then our conscious brain kicks in to investigate if we're actively looking.
Fascinating how our eyes give clues, even before we're fully aware of a problem. And the study by Green and colleagues on thematically odd phrases shows that sensitivity extends beyond just logical contradictions to the overall coherence, the flow of the text.
Precisely. Increased reading times for phrases that didn't fit the topic indicated sensitivity to the disruption in thematic flow, even if they couldn't articulate exactly what was wrong. And even more indirect measures like physiological responses, changes in skin conductance, GSRs, like in the Tecomira of Enclaco study with violations of physical laws, can reveal subconscious detection of inconsistencies that readers might not even report consciously. It's like our bodies sometimes know more than our conscious minds in the moment.
So we're taking in all this info, and sometimes we catch problems, sometimes we don't. What seem to be some key factors influencing whether we actually identify these problems?
Well, as we've touched on, Baker's research consistently emphasizes the huge impact of specific instructions. Tell people what kinds of problems to look for, they're much more likely to find them. This probably relates to Grice's cooperative principles. We usually assume texts will be coherent and truthful, so we might try to make sense of inconsistencies rather than flag them unless we have a reason to be actively looking. Also, as we discussed, the type of problem matters. Surface-level issues like word errors are easier than those requiring deep integration.
And the research on whether problems with main ideas are easier or harder to detect. That seems to be a bit of a mixed bag based on the article, doesn't it? Some studies found them more noticeable, others didn't find a clear pattern. Reasons for this inconsistency aren't totally clear.
Yeah, it highlights the complexity. Different problems might interact differently with our monitoring. Now, this research on given new information by Glenberg and Zabrucki is really interesting. The idea that contradictions presented as new info are less likely to be detected. Why do you think that might be?
That's counterintuitive. Why would new info contradicting what we know be harder to spot?
Well, the theory is when information is presented as new, readers might not actively try to connect it back to the given or already established info in the text. So a contradiction with something read earlier might slip by because they're not actively making that connection right then. However, Baker and Wagner's work found the opposite pattern for false given info. Violating our world knowledge readers were actually less likely to identify that inconsistency. Suggests we might be less critical of info presented as already established or assumed true.
So what we think we already know, or what the author presents as a given, might get less scrutiny. And Epstein's research on co-activation really emphasizes how factors like how close together contradictory ideas are and how they're worded impact detection. If conflicting ideas are far apart, phrased differently, or only implied, we're much less likely to catch it.
Exactly. For us to notice an inconsistency, both conflicting pieces likely need to be active in our working memory around the same time. Anything hindering that coactivation, a big gap, different phrasing, reduces the chances. Now, recognizing a problem is only half the battle. What do we actually do then? That's where regulation of comprehension, those fix-up strategies, come in.
Yes, the mental toolkit for when things go wrong.
Yeah.
The article mentions these strategies vary in how disruptive they are.
Right. Ignoring it is least disruptive, but obviously not helpful. More active strategies include rereading, looking ahead for clarification, or setting up those pending questions we mentioned, hoping the text addresses them later. While much of what we know comes from verbal reports, there's some interesting empirical evidence from observing behavior directly, too.
Like the Baker and Anderson study showing spontaneous rereading on inconsistencies. But then Alexander's work found we don't automatically reread when trying to answer questions.
Correct. However, Alessi's research showed that encouraging students to look back at relevant sections for incorrectly answered questions actually improved test performance. And Bloom's study on offering lookups, essentially simplified rewrites of difficult sentences, showed readers use these aids strategically, and they can lead to better recall.
So having these fix-up options and knowing when and how to use them effectively seems really crucial for good comprehension. Now, we've spent a lot of time talking about monitoring comprehension during reading, but the article also delves into assessing comprehension after finishing. This self-assessment area seems to have developed a bit separately, hasn't it?
It has. Research on self-assessment often grew out of studies on confidence in test answers. While we're generally okay at judging if we got a specific question right after a test, predicting overall performance before or assessing understanding of a text just read is often much harder. This is where the illusion of knowing comes in.
Yes, that often unsettling feeling we think we understand something way better than we actually do. Glenberg and Epstein's work really brought this to the forefront, didn't it?
Absolutely. Their early studies found people rated comprehension of text with contradictions quite high, even though they completely missed those inconsistencies when asked. A real disconnect between subjective feeling and actual demonstrable comprehension. They later refined this with the concept of being poorly calibrated. Our confidence doesn't accurately reflect our ability to answer questions or identify problems.
And their research showed this poor calibration wasn't just with tricky inference questions. It happened even with basic facts and main ideas. The link they found between how familiar something felt and confidence is also really telling. Suggests we often mistake familiarity for genuine comprehension.
Precisely. Just because something feels familiar doesn't automatically mean we truly understand it deeply. They also found giving feedback after a pretest could improve calibration, but only if the pretest was relevant to the later material. And a really interesting finding from Glenberg and Epstein's '87 study was that people were often more poorly calibrated in their own area of expertise. That's quite surprising.
It is counterintuitive. You'd think you'd have a better sense of what you know in your own field. Why did they think that might be?
Their suggestion is, when reading in our own domain, we might rely too much on our general feeling of competence rather than carefully assessing comprehension of the specific material. We might think, I'm an expert, so I must understand this, without the active checking needed for true understanding, a form of overconfidence.
That makes a lot of sense. Complacency. Now, Maki and Berry's research also looked at self-assessment, finding a general tendency towards overconfidence too. However, they also noted better performers were more accurate at predicting which specific parts of the text they'd answer correctly about. So while overall calibration might be off, those who actually understand better have a better sense of their own strengths and weaknesses within that material.
That's an important nuance. While the general trend might be overestimation, those with a better grasp seem to have a more accurate internal map of their understanding, knowing where it's solid, where it's weaker. And Presley's PRIP research, looking at perceived readiness for exams, echoed this general lack of accurate self-assessment. Accuracy was highest after the test, really a post-diction, and lowest before reading the material.
So we're often not very good at judging how well prepared we are before being tested. But the fact that including questions during reading seem to improve the accuracy of post-reading assessments is promising. Suggests active engagement through self-testing helps us get a more realistic sense.
Exactly. That active engagement forces deeper processing, gives more concrete feedback. And Mackey and Sweat's finding that prediction accuracy was better with easy, narrative texts and free recalls suggests the text type and assessment method also influence self-assessment accuracy. Finally, Sharma and Serber's work on reading purpose highlighted that when just skimming difficult text superficially, the illusion of knowing is highest. And their summary analysis revealed poor self-assessment can link directly to actual misunderstandings, not just lack of detail.
It all really points to the fact that accurately judging our own comprehension is a complex skill we're not always very good at. And the closed test study by Hosseini and Furl provides more evidence of this gap between perceived understanding and actual ability to fill in missing info. Now, the article also touches on how these metacognitive skills might develop as we get older. We know quite a bit about development in kids and teens, but what about later in adulthood?
That's a really interesting and important question. Baker points out that for a long time, the assumption was these skills were pretty much fully developed by adulthood. But the research we've discussed suggests that's not necessarily true. Kitchener's distinction between basic metacognition, task awareness, and epistemic cognition, broader understanding of knowledge itself, is useful here. She suggests this higher-level understanding continues developing in late adolescence and into adulthood.
And Ryan's work connecting epistemological beliefs, dualist versus relativist, to comprehension evaluation in college students seems to support this ongoing development idea. The upperclassmen, more relativistic, used more sophisticated comprehension-focused standards compared to freshmen.
Exactly. And Otero and Campanario's research with 10th and 12th graders showed older students were better at identifying inconsistencies, had less illusion of knowing, and made more appropriate regulation decisions compared to younger students. So we definitely see improvements during adolescence.
So we see development through adolescence and early adulthood, but beyond college, does our ability to think about thinking while reading keep evolving or maybe start to decline?
The research there is a bit more limited, and findings are somewhat mixed. Studies on metamemory, awareness of memory abilities, in older adults show inconsistent results. Some suggest improvement, some decline, some no change. Seam-specific cognitive tasks matter a lot. Research on other metacognitive skills, like learning new concepts or choosing strategies, also shows varied patterns in older adulthood. Task demands seem important. Zabrucki and colleagues compared younger and older adults on inconsistency detection and found no significant age difference. However, older adults showed less illusion of knowing with certain inconsistencies, maybe suggesting potentially better calibration in those specific situations. They also found a positive correlation between education level and problem identification, regardless of age.
That link between education level and monitoring across the lifespan is intriguing. Could mean skills keep developing with more education, or people with better monitoring skills pursue more education. Hard to say definitively, but it highlights the continued importance of these skills. Now, given all this research showing how important metacognitive oils are and that they aren't always as strong as they could be, what can we actually do to enhance them in adults? What interventions or training will work?
Thankfully, this area has received increasing attention. Many adult learning and study strategy programs now explicitly include metacognitive components. Common effective approaches include modeling and using think aloud techniques, and instructors demonstrate strategies and verbalize their thinking. Reciprocal teaching, where learners take turns leading discussions and applying strategies, can also be very beneficial. And then there's direct training in specific strategies, summarizing effectively, generating useful self-questions, monitoring comprehension. Finally, self-control training, teaching learners to actively regulate their own learning process and apply strategies independently, is another promising area.
The idea of using think alouds not just for research but as a teaching method seems really powerful. As Nist and Kirby point out, standardized tests measure the outcome, but think alouds reveal the underlying process, pinpointing where students get stuck or use ineffective strategies, a much more direct window.
Exactly. Think alouds offer valuable diagnostic info for instructors and a powerful way to model effective strategies. And as you mentioned, training in specific strategies like summarizing and self-questioning shows positive effects. Brozo and colleagues compared summarizing, generating test questions, and a QAR strategy, finding effectiveness often depended on the assessment type. And King's research highlighted matching strategy to assessment demands, summarizing being particularly good for essays requiring deeper understanding.
But Balachty's finding that self-questioning helped with the difficult passages but hindered on easy ones is an interesting cautionary note. Suggests we need to be mindful of when and why a strategy is appropriate, not just apply everything all the time.
Absolutely. Effective training isn't just teaching a list of strategies, it's teaching learners when, where, and why to use them effectively, and how to monitor and regulate their application. The LATME program by Schenkman and Kukras for underprepared college students is a great example of a comprehensive approach focusing on making metacognitive activities overt. Its success, compared to traditional, separate study skills training, underscores the value of this strategic self-regulatory focus.
And it's encouraging that even already successful students, like the law students in Lunderberg's research, can still benefit. Providing guidelines and self-control training help them learn more effectively from complex legal cases. Highlights these skills are valuable at all levels.
It does. And as Baker's article concludes, the benefits extend beyond academia. She cites the Robinson and Whitfield study showing training patients to ask better questions, improve their understanding of medical advice. And as we discussed, Michalecki's research points to the significant relevance in various workplaces. So it's not just about being a better student, it's about being a more effective learner and performer in all areas of life.
So, to bring everything together, this deep dive into Linda Baker's 1989 article gives us some really fundamental insights. We've seen our individual ideas about understanding and monitoring differ, and better readers learners tend to be more aware and in control of their thinking as they read. We've also explored how adults evaluate and regulate comprehension, but it's clear there's often room for improvement, especially in accurately assessing how well we've actually grasped things.
Yes, that self-assessment piece, really knowing what we know and don't, is often a huge challenge. We tend to overestimate that illusion of knowing. And across the board, the research consistently shows more sophisticated metacognitive skills linked to better reading comprehension and overall learning performance.
And crucially, we've learned these skills aren't set in stone. They can be developed through targeted training, teaching us not just what strategies exist, but when, why, and how to use them effectively. So as you move forward with your own learning, I want to leave you with this thought. Based on everything we've explored, what is one specific reading strategy you might experiment with next time you're learning something new? Maybe try actively verbalizing your thoughts or consciously connecting new info with old. Take some time to really reflect on your own reading process. You might be surprised how much more you get out of it when you become a more active, reflective participant.